because it was an interracial, not a black institution, the vanguard of white women physicians in this area were Howard graduates, as were the white women lawyers. The first two women to be licensed to practice medicine in Washington, D.C. in 1875 were Mary D. Spackman, class of 72, Howard University Medical School, and Mary A. Parsons, class of 74. They were both graduates of Howard. Likewise, the first woman to be licensed to practice medicine in the state of Virginia was a white Howard graduate. The first woman to practice law in the District of Columbia was a black graduate of Howard, Charlotte Ray, of the class of 1872. The other law schools and medical schools in this city did not admit women until after World War II. Harvard admitted its first woman in medicine in 1945 and in law several years later. Why is this important? Winston has gone off on a tangent. Is it only a quaint fact of 19th century race and gender relations? It is important because it illustrates that Howard was prepared for Barack Obama's America over 140 years ago. Howard evolved into what some people call a black institution because of the imposition of white supremacy as national policy in the 1890s and our need to focus our resources on building an emancipatory leadership. Although historical irony is always with us, it would be tragic if this institution cannot adapt to compete in a world that it had a major hand in creating in over a period of a century. I could say the same thing with reference to foreign students. Our first Chinese students were here in 1872. Our first African students in 1873 and 1874. When I was vice president, we not only had students from every state in the Union, we had students from 90 foreign countries. We had the largest percentage of foreign students at this university of any university in the United States. Now, why do I say that? Because it puts some qualifications on your notion of what it is that this institution is up to. And it also tells us something about our need to yet make further adjustments. We have made adjustments in every period of American history because it's an old institution. And some of us, I must say, are stuck in the late 1960s and early 1970s, in my view. I would also remind you that in 1969, Howard students organized a national conference called Taboo, T-A-B-U, and it was a big deal. It almost closed this place. It was called Toward a Black University, because in their view, Howard was not black, was not aligned with the needs and values of what the students called the black community. That aspect of identity searching, student-initiated, resulted in a renewed institution in many ways, one with a more explicit focus on issues of race, power, and community. What is the imperative now? That was 41 years ago. Moving on, may we therefore agree that Howard is a university, one that has stood for racial and gender equality, committed to the transformation of an unjust society. It was never intended to be a refuge from reality. What kind of university? Since the 1950s, it has been clear to some observers that unless Howard made the transition from a comprehensive university that gave priority to teaching to one that also focused on research and graduate training, it would lose its place in the constellation of American universities and its ability to attract adequate resources. The same challenge, for example, faced Stanford University after World War II. Stanford's program of development has taken it from that earlier model to one in which, in many fields, it is substantially superior to Harvard and Yale. In our case, the challenge was compounded by resource constraints, the need to continue to devote more energy to teaching than is common in most research universities, and imposed racial limitations, internal and external. And the internal ones are our fault. Any discussion of the change from the Moorland collection to the Moorland-Spingarn Research Center must be anchored in the reality that the change was a part of President James E. Cheek's larger strategy to make Howard into what he called a university of the first rank. He said that repeatedly, over and over again, a university of the first rank. Notice there are no qualifiers on that, a university of the first rank. Overall, he increased Howard Library resources during his administration by 171%. And the MSRC was regarded by him as the crown jewel of the institution's research resources. In national terms, no laboratory at Howard and no other research resource had at that time the potential of Moorland to change the research profile of the institution. I have sketched the proposition that Howard is and always has been a university, and that its identity is not described adequately by simply calling it Black or an HBCU. Well, now we can discuss that. But the third part of the triad is what time it is. Now, for the institution, that may be the most pressing issue of all, because here we are. The university has more program than it has resources. The original premise of President Cheek's plan was that the Congress and the major foundations would support fully the development of Howard as a major research institution across the board in law, medicine, the arts and sciences, engineering, and the other fields. And this part is very important. Growing to an enrollment exceeding 20,000 students. Until the mid-1970s, that plan was supported, and the university's budget, faculty, and staff salaries, its schools and colleges, libraries, laboratories, and its physical plant reflected that new reality. In the case of libraries, Howard's rating in the Association of Research Libraries went from dead last, the very bottom in the nation, to 17th out of 106 institutions in terms of growth and development, ahead of our competitors, Georgetown, George Washington, American, and Catholic. Then cometh trouble. When the federal appropriation exceeded $100 million, attitudes began to change, as it became clear that Dr. Cheek was not thinking or acting in HBCU terms. He was, it was then clear, serious about a university of the first rank, a top research university with no racial qualifiers respecting resources. I once heard him. Sometimes a moment will tell you about a person. I was walking behind him, and a faculty member said to him, "That's mighty fancy for Howard." And he turned and squinted, got slightly purple, and said, "Nothing is too good for Howard." All right. He meant it. For more than 20 years, the funding streams of Howard have not been commensurate with the programs and expectations developed in the early 1970s. We must now acknowledge, therefore, that the expansion of the 1970s was not sustained in terms of support and was probably more of a public